Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
HSBC bestrides the banking world like a colossus.
But it's in big trouble. It has paid penalties of millions of dollars for doing business with Mexican drug cartels and other dodgy dealings.
And that was before that old reliable of scandals, a Swiss banking imbroglio, burst upon the scene like a box of rotting eggs.
A dirty laundry list as long as Oxford Street has been revealed, involving some big names and even some members of Parliament.
I, of course, am not one of them. But Lords have been a-leaping. Lords we didn't know existed. Who knew that Britain was in part governed by someone called Lord Fink? I'm not making that up. But he was one of the tax dodgers, along with other lords and beneficiaries of trust funds set up by their billionaire fathers.
It was not the attraction of Swiss cheese which drew them to Geneva, but rather the opportunity to either evade or avoid tax.
Joining us now to survey the mountain of troubles surrounding this is an alternative economist of great distinction. Professor Steve Keen is the author of a wonderful book, Debunking Economics, and the head of school at Kingston University. Professor Keen, thanks. It's an honour for you to join us. You saw all this coming. Survey the rotting eggs for us, if you will.
Oh, it's the banking sector is, as Marx and Keynes both separately put it, is a great servant and a terrible master. And what we've allowed happen in the last 50 years is they've gone from the days when the banks were effectively the servants of the industrial sector, providing the money they needed for investment and so on, through to the stage where the masters, not just of the industrial sector, but the politicians as well.
Indeed so, and David Cameron ennobled the head of HSBC, even though he must have known that this and other scandals were either in the pipeline or had burst wide open already.
Well, there have been plenty of scandals in the financial sector all the way through. If you go back and look at even the formation of Citibank, that formation broke the law in America at the time. And if you know that hilarious photograph of Bill Clinton signing a document with a big smile on his face.
He always had a big smile on his face.
Almost as big as other times, and I'm sure. Surrounded by a whole bunch of people, smiling financial faces. He was legalising an illegal act of forming a merger. Now, the classic statement about bankers, I think, was made by a West Australian premier many, many years ago, talking about a particular Ponzi schemer called Laurie Connell. And he was known as Last Resort Laurie in Western Australia, the last person. If you needed money, Laurie would provide it, but it would cost you an arm and a leg and a couple of other useful parts of your body. And Laurie, you see, the Premier said he wouldn't want to stand between Laurie Connell and a bucket of money. Now, banks are by definition buckets of money, and this sort of behaviour is just endemic in them when you let them get to be as big and as politically powerful as they've become under neoliberalism.
That's what it is, isn't it? You've put your finger on it. It's systemic.
Yeah,
it's
systemic.
Not because you have a particular scoundrel heading this bank or another.
The only thing HSBC did wrong was being caught.
Yeah, how were they caught, by the way?
By a whistleblower. And this is where it comes down to individuals having a sense of ethics that's far stronger than these institutions themselves have, who had access to the computer records, had the intelligence to know how to pull those records out, and then got arrested in Switzerland, managed to get out on bail, and then jumped countries, got to France, and here you have to have great respect for the French authorities. When they saw what he had, they didn't get extradited back to Switzerland, where it would have all completely disappeared if they'd taken him back there. So the French looked at it and they saw the amount of evasion going on, and the French said, this is in a sense, a gold mine for us. We know we haven't been getting the tax revenues from the wealthy. Now we know a large part of the reason why. Let's prosecute this. And the English, who normally I respect for the extent to which they allow political liberalism, pretty much completely ignored the information coming across from the French until the press broke it in the last few months.
Well, this is another important point you've put your finger on, because the contradiction here is that the state any state, needs this money really badly.
Yeah.
So they're caught in a kind of paradigm in which their neoliberal instincts are to allow the rich to run rampant.
Yeah.
But their bills, their debits as states require going after these tax avoiders.
I know, and what it tends to happen is they don't go after them. Instead, they impose strictures upon the working class and the middle class who can't get away, and they cut back on the services we get, so they have less of a gap between their taxation and their spending. So this is a classic case where I look back and see brilliant statements in the past. Remember, of course, the phrase the military-industrial complex was coined by President Eisenhower.
Of all people.
Of all people. I think he was wrong, unfortunately, because the military-industrial complex is a far better beast to run you than what I call the politico-financial complex we now have.
There's more real jobs.
There's more real jobs. At least they make stuff and they blow it up later. But in the case of the financial sector, they create nothing. They create Ponzi schemes. And the politicians have now got so used to a financial sector at the scale of the sector we now have that they can't imagine it any other way. So we go through a financial crisis, and what is their first response after the panic spending that stopped us going into a complete Great Depression? Their first response is to rescue the financial sector and get it back to the scale it was
beforehand. Back to what it was before, before it brought us to the edge of the cliff.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, when you try to talk about policies which might actually benefit the ordinary person, things like what I call quantitative easing for the people or a modern debt jubilee, you're told, well, that's going to raise moral hazard. What on earth do they think they've been doing?
I don't know if there's any minister left with the chutzpah to use the phrase moral hazard, because morality was the first casualty
well and truly.
Of all of this. We're trapped in what someone once called the great money trick, the great money illusion.
Yeah.
Tell us what an alternative economy would look like.
Well, I mean, there's plenty of people putting out proposals which effectively are trying to stop the financial sector having the capacity to create money, which is where this largely emanates from. And what that means is who else creates money? And that gives you the government as the only other possible source of money creation. Now, the government has been deliberately falling down on its job because they don't think they should do that anymore, so they've handed the whole responsibility over to the private sector. Because of neoliberal ideology.
Yeah.
The nonsense economic vision that conventional economics has, which talks and tells us how to run the monetary system while their models themselves largely ignore the existence of banks' debt money completely. It's ironic that they do that. But there's nonetheless a need for private money creation and a need for government money creation. We live in a mixed economy. You need both of them to happen. But you want that money creation to be done sensibly, wisely. Now, the trouble is the bigger these banks get, the less they know about the customers they deal with. They go from back in the old days of the Jimmy Stewart-style bank where he knew everybody in the town, he knew whose idea was likely to be a good one and whose...
He knew their dog, he knew their granny.
Yeah, and this was a large part of the old Glass-Steagall Act. By breaking American banks down, making them regional and giving them just a very tiny physical fief over which they had the capacity to issue loans and therefore create money, they largely did it for successful businesses they had some feeling were going to be successful. So there's personal knowledge on behalf of the managers and so on. And I've come to realise over time, I didn't think it was all that important looking back on it, but when you look at what's happened now, you've gone from that level towards credit scoring and point systems. And I've been contacted by people who write the software that does the point scoring system for some of the banks in Australia, and they're now selling it globally. And they tell me that it's a 20-second process to go from somebody applying for it to working out how much collateral they have to deciding to give them a loan. That is the sort of thing that gives you bubbles and Ponzi schemes and the capacity for banks to behave illegally and call it management, call it banking. So I think we have to go back to the days when banks were small. The whole idea of large banks itself is a problem. And we have to go back to the point where banks largely only make their money by lending to genuine businesses, because instead what they're doing, they're creating money, which we need them to do, but they're creating money into the housing sector, into the share markets, etc., etc. All they're doing is inflating asset bubbles, and a remainder washes over into the real economy. But we don't get that creative generation of new businesses that we should be getting out of their capacity to create money.
Everybody should know what a Ponzi scheme is, but they don't. Is it a kind of pyramid selling?
A Ponzi scheme is a scheme where you make money by getting more money coming in than you're dealing out, but you're actually not producing anything in the middle, or largely. So Charles Ponzi is, of course, the classic for it. believed that he worked out a way to make money through arbitrage of stamps back in the late 1910s. And what he realised was the stamp authorities globally enabled you to buy a stamp with an American dollar and then get a stamp in Italy when you sent to get a return post. And he realised that because of the change in currency values after the First World War, there was a huge gap. It was cheaper to buy them in Italy and bring them to America. So that was his actual way to try to make money. He never managed to organise it. He promised people a 50% return in 45 days, and the 46th day elapsed before it even worked out the scheme. So the first depositor turns up wanting his money back. He gave them the money from the second and third depositor. So they grow and then they collapse. And that's, in a sense, I see the housing sector as the same thing.
Yeah, it's a pretty good description of our situation.
Well, having said that the HSBC scandal is systematic, HSBC being the largest bank in Britain, which bank is next? And can we, I mean,
which bank houses in its bowels ethical, honest whistleblower with access to computer technology?
It's as simple as that.
I don't know. That's all it comes down to.
The British government is blocking an inquiry into the HSBC scandal.
Can you imagine not holding in an inquiry into something that might be done by a Labor council somewhere? Of course they'll do it. When you get this huge thing by people who are donors to the political party in power, why bother?
Well, yes, I mean, you've identified several key points, and in a way, that's the one we'll have to close on. This is entirely circular. Politicians go and work for these banks when they cease being politicians. The bankers make huge donations to the politicians when they're politicians, and the politicians legislate for a framework and inquiry or no inquiry to the benefit of the people who helped them get into power in the first place and will employ them later. It's a rotten box of eggs, this, isn't it?
It is indeed, but if they're going to go work for Jimmy Stewart, they wouldn't get paid enough and it wouldn't happen. We need to go back to small banks.
Professor, I really encourage everyone to get this book. It's published by Zed, and it's called Debunking Economics. Now, there's a question mark. It says, the emperor dethroned, question mark. It's the question mark that interests me. If we were lucky enough still to be here in 20 years, are we still going to be in this mess?
Well, Yanis Varoufakis, being a good friend of mine, caught in the same situation, the feeling you might still be caught there is why he's pushing for reform rather than revolution. And I think the same thing. I think I'm going to be stuck with a question mark. I'd like to have an exclamation mark one of these days, but I'm never confident about that.
Me too. I'm looking forward to that exclamation mark. Professor Steve Keen, you're a real star turn, I must say. You make economics understandable to ordinary people, and that's not common. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.
Coming up after the break, it's almost 50 years since the killing fields in Indonesia, my own country. Millions were murdered, and if you want to know by whom and what happened next, it's all coming up after the break. Welcome back to Sputnik. In 1967, Indonesia's founding father, President Sukarno, was overthrown in a US organized coup. One of the organizers, Henry Kissinger, still alive. The military seized power, appointed the dictator Suharto, who then proceeded to massacre millions of Sukarno's supporters.
The Act of Killing, a film by Joshua Oppenheimer, which has won awards all over the world, represents the only international recognition of the crimes against humanity which were carried out in those days. It is a part of world history, however, that we are determined to recover and to try and hold to account the perpetrators, alive or dead. Joining us now is Dr. Soe Tjen Marching, who's working on a memoir of that period. Dr. Soe, thank you for joining us. The Act of Killing brought to an international audience for the first time in 50 years. The massacre, which has not been seen since the Holocaust, of millions of people in an important country, one of the most populous countries in the world, yet almost nobody knows anything about it. That adds insult to injury, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, of course. And not only that, even now, they're still in power even. And they
As a vice president even.
Yes, exactly. And the victims and their families are still stigmatized and even prosecuted, you know.
Tell us what happened.
In 1965, what happened was there was on the 1st of October, there was a murder of generals. And the Communist Party was blamed for that. And then the blame was not only on the Communist Party, but also the communists as a whole, and also the left-wing sympathizers. And my father was one of the victims. He was imprisoned.
And there was basically murder squads roaming the streets, looking for, first, people who were communists, and second, people who were Indonesians of Chinese ethnicity.
Yes, and
because they
left-wing
were thought to
sympathizers.
be the base of the left.
Yes, and left-wing sympathizers, and not only left-wing sympathizers, actually. Anyone could be murdered or could be imprisoned if the official says, if the officials just point their fingers to them. That's it. They would be booked. And the number of the people murdered is still not really known. Now some mention 1 million, some 2 million, some 3 million. But the
1, 2, or 3 million.
Exactly. It's like it doesn't matter for them.
Are almost incomprehensible
Yes, yes.
to people. In the act of killing, we saw some of the perpetrators not only describe what they did, but act it out.
They boast.
They boasted of it, and they acted it out, how they killed people with piano wire and decapitated people.
And they tell about this while walking about in a shopping mall with their family.
Yes, that's a problem, because they are proud of it, because they are seen as heroes, and they see themselves as heroes. That's the problem, right? Because the victims are still victimized, are still stigmatized. So that's why the perpetrators have this opportunity to say that we are heroes. And this is the problem for me. If the government hasn't done anything and doesn't want to do anything, then that's why we have to do something. And at the moment, that's why we have established this organization called IPT 65, International People Tribunals Against the Genocide in 1965.
And this tribunal is based where?
It's based in the Netherlands. So it started there. It started because of the film by Joshua Oppenheimer, The Act of Killing. And then we just thought, look, is this all? We must do something after this, right? We must take action. And if the government doesn't do anything, then we, the people, have to do something. So that's what we did. We established this. And by RPT 65, it means that this is a court case held by the people.
Yes, a people's tribunal. Of course, I'm familiar with the model.
Yeah.
How did it come to pass that the Communist Party in Indonesia, which was one of the biggest in the whole world, third biggest communist party in the whole world,
outside of Russia and China,
yes, after Russia and China, Indonesia's party was the biggest. It had millions of supporters, many millions of supporters, because Indonesia is a big place.
Yes.
How was it able to be crushed so comprehensively? Still illegal, doesn't exist.
Yes.
The left doesn't exist in Indonesia. 50 years later, there is no left. And when one talks, as I have, to Indonesian Chinese, I asked them if they were Chinese. They were really shocked, scandalized that I would ask them. They were instinctively afraid of that question because of the witch hunt against people of Chinese.
They would say, no, I'm Indonesian.
How did this happen? Was it like salami, that the people were taken one by one in small slices? Why was the party not able to defend itself?
They were not ready, and they didn't know that this would happen, I think. Because my father, this is the story of my father. My mom kept telling me that he was not involved in the Communist Party. He was only in the left-wing organization. He didn't really know what happened. Only 2 years ago, my mother told me something else. She called me and she said, look, your father was actually one of the committee members of the Indonesian Communist Party.
One of the leaders.
So they kept this from you all this time?
They kept this as a secret. One of the committee members, it's not like a big one, he's not like an important one, and that's why he was not murdered. And he was just appointed just before the genocide happened, so not many people found out about it. And my mum burned all of the papers, so that's why he was not murdered. But he didn't know anything, so they weren't ready. They didn't know what was going on. So when the genocide happened, they got confused. Also the people.
Well, it's the job of a communist to know what's going on. Why did no one come to their aid? Why did China not come to their aid? Why did the Soviet Union not come to their aid? Was it impossible in the world balance of power at that time?
I think it was just a matter of benefit. If it didn't disadvantage them, they wouldn't do anything, I think. And it didn't really, advantage anyone to defend Indonesia at that time, I think.
Why was the US so determined to get rid of Sukarno?
Well, because Indonesia was really, in a way, it was a big country. And if it became communist, it was dangerous for the West. And for China and Russia to oppose the West, maybe it was just too impossible for them. They had to consider the gain then.
Because in Sukarno's time, Indonesia was really something, yeah? It had hosted the Bandung Conference. It had become a pole around which much of the so-called non-aligned movement was orbiting. And therefore, a decision was made in Washington. I mean, I know you want to, instinctively, you want to blame the actual perpetrators, but the masterminds of this massacre were in Washington.
Well, you can say that, yes. We can say that this is actually in Washington because the CIA had been planning it for years and years and years. But with the IPT, actually, we don't concentrate on the perpetrators and who was, in a way, who was the mastermind or everything. We concentrate on the victims to rehabilitate them. That's more important for us at the moment.
Back in society.
Yes, to get back the society and to basically to be admitted, for the government to admit that they are victims and stop stigmatizing them. Because, I've seen the movie The Railway Man, actually, and there the victim meets the perpetrator. He can only forgive the perpetrator when the perpetrator says, yes, you have been victimized, and I am sorry for that. Before then, it's impossible.
What about compensation? People lost their fathers, their husbands, their brothers, mothers, sisters. They lost property. They lost their businesses.
Yes.
Indonesia is a very rich country.
Yes.
Shouldn't people be financially compensated?
I think so. I do believe in that people have to be compensated, but that's a long way from what we expect. This is like, if the victims are still stigmatized, they have to be acknowledged first as victims, and they're still really angry. A lot of them are depressed, and I can't really blame them for being angry.
What about the new president now? He's not a leftist, but
he stands out.
He leans in the direction of Sukarno's ideas.
Yes.
Although his vice president is one of the criminals.
Oh, yes. I'm quite disappointed with it.
Yeah. Are you likely to get any justice from the new president of Indonesia?
I was hopeful, to be honest, but now I start doubting him. He is still much, much better than his opponent, than Prabowo.
Obviously.
Much better.
General.
And I don't regret voting for him. But I start doubting it, and I think, doubting doesn't mean that you don't do anything. We have to do more. We have to make an effort because...
Well, he'll only be able to do anything if there's a big swell of popular support
we have
for
to do
what he's
something.
doing.
We have to keep voicing whatever, we believe in and to push the government. And that's why this is the function of IPT 1965. We want to put pressure on the government and on the United Nations. Look, this is important. And why you keep quiet?
Yeah.
Well, Indonesia was once great under Sukarno. Let's hope it can return to center stage in world events in the next period. Good luck with your tribunal. If there's anything we can do to help, we're more than happy to do so.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Putri.
Dr. Soe
so much.
Tjen Marching, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, we received a tremendous response on the act of killing that we promoted on Twitter, which is good. So a lot of people have seen it. And Oliver Volker says, this film is excellent. It was in German TV last year. No one is accountable, of course, because the killers were on our side, like Blair and Bush.
It's important to emphasize the act of killing is a film like no other. It is the Sistine Chapel of films. It is Michelangelo. Joshua Oppenheimer is a genius. He has captured in a movie a story of such epic proportions and bizarre and perverse character. He's captured this in a movie. If there's anybody out there who has not yet seen the act of killing, I beg them to see it. I tweeted at the time, as you'll recall, I'm rarely speechless, but after watching this film,
You were in tears.
I am literally speechless, as well as you say, with tears running down our face.
Well, it's needless to say that it was, of course, not allowed. It was banned in Indonesia, so it was, you know, underground. It was shown underground, but obviously only to targeted people. The mass audience, the public in Indonesia, they just don't know about it. It's been completely kept.
The mass of the public everywhere don't know.
And that's
about
why
it.
Jack Tipple says an anti-PKI film was shown every year on national TV in Indonesia until very recently, PKI being the Indonesian Communist Party. And that's the problem. That's the norm in Indonesia, which is obviously very saddening. And that's all that we've got for this week.
Which means, alas, that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.